Well, hello and welcome to an episode of New Kinship. This is David Frank, and it is just me hosting as the interviewer today. And here, my friend Lakshmi and my new friend Erin. Thank you both for joining today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So this episode is coming out of really um, Lakshmi's initiative as you're at seminary. What's the
The Earlham School of Religion, which is a seminary in Indiana.
and you've been studying the question, how as Christians ought we to engage with wealth within the neoliberal capitalist system we are in? We'll get into all those things, but I was so excited because some of the episodes that I've done around common life, a lot of that intersects money. And that's so much about American, or not just American, but a lot of modern life is impacted by the assumptions about how money should be working, what we should be doing with it, and it impacts our relationships very significantly. So I was really excited to see the thoughts that you were cultivating, and uh, yeah, but before we get into that, just briefly, would you both like to just introduce yourselves a little bit? I mean, and maybe you can share then what brings you to this topic in question, what makes you passionate about it.
Yeah, I can go. My name is Lakshmi, and I'm currently studying an MDiv at the Earlham School of Religion. And I'm currently originally from the UK, which you can probably hear from my accent. And my main area of interest is intentional Christian community, which feels very adjacent to this topic. Um, and I've been thinking about this because I grew up in a solidly middle class family. We spent money carefully, but we always had enough. And
Mm.
as a family, there's a culture of seeing saving as a good thing and a sensible thing. Um, but now, as a young adult and making my own decisions and taking my faith more seriously, there's a questioning of like, hey, but how much should I be saving? How much should I save for my own financial security? And how much should I be giving to others? Um, in the privileged position that I know that I have the potential to earn a lot of money. And so it's like, what do I do with it if it comes my way? Um, and so wanting to really take seriously what the Bible has to say, because the Bible says pretty dramatic things about wealth. And I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to really understand that. And it felt like no one was talking about it. And I was like, why aren't we talking about it? And so that sparked research into this topic as part of my ethics class.
Mm-hmm. And Lakshmi, I actually first heard her voice on her podcast, The Dwelling Place, which is just a really lovely work that primarily going around and interviewing um, different intentional communities in the UK and in the US. So thanks for your work there. It's been super fun to learn from the wisdom of all those stories.
Thank you.
Erin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Erin. I am also an MDiv student, although not at the same school, at a sister school. I am originally a Midwesterner, born and raised, but I now live in the Mid-Atlantic, not too far from DC. And I have actually wrestled with this question for a long time. I became a Christian when I was, I don't know, maybe 35, but even before that, I cared about issues of, I don't know, justice and the world being an unfair place. But I think that for me, the my interest in the topic is just driven by the cognitive dissonance, right? Of, like there's recognition that
Mm,
living as a middle class person in America, this like, white bread, middle class, like respectable, conventional way of living my life is not the same thing as what Jesus calls us to be. And so, whereas our the choices that we make around our spending, our consumption, our giving, how much of those shaped by the just the norms and the standards of the culture that surrounds us, and how much of those are shaped by, our calling and our responsiveness to calling as a person of faith.
hmm Yeah, thank you both so much. I to get into this conversation a little bit, um, I just want to really make sure that um, we just said there's a lot of terms like money and wealth and uh, sometimes even capital. But we'll just start with wealth. How do you guys define wealth and wealth accumulation? What maybe even pictures come to mind when you think about those things?
So I'll jump in on that one. Like it would be very easy to say wealth is the accumulation of money, right? And we think we know what rich and poor is. But I gave as a lay speaker, I gave a sermon, I don't know, maybe last year, that pointed out that like if you are middle class in America, if you have access to healthcare, if you have a cell phone, if you have stable housing, you have enough food on a regular basis, you are immensely wealthy. You are among the wealthiest people in the world today. You are among the wealthiest people who have ever lived in the history of the world. We lose sight of that because, our next door neighbor drives a nicer car and has a pool, right? But I always like to convince people that if you're middle class in America, you are wealthy. And the admonitions in scripture are talking to you. So respond to that. Hey, take that seriously. But in answer to the question about wealth and what it means, is not just about the accumulation of money. It is about stability. It is about like ease and convenience. It is about comfort. Like as a middle class person, if I am hot, turn on the AC, right? I don't have to spend my time sitting at a bus stop, relying on an unreliable schedule. I get in my car, right? It is ease and convenience. It is comfort. It is the ability to take risks because you have a safety net. It is opportunity. It is education. It is stability, along with like the ability to save for the future and the ability to make choices about your spending that are not driven solely by, you know, by need. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that would be
Mm-hmm.
our response about what wealth is. And I think it's a lot bigger than money. It's about
Mm-hmm.
privilege. It's about all those things I just talked
Lakshmi, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think when I researched this question, I was looking specifically at money and what to do with money. But in interacting with that question, acknowledging that even if I had $0 in the bank, I have an education, I have a family who would house me, I have friends who can house me. And so acknowledging that privilege and that security and that ability to take risks, even if I had zero money whatsoever. Um, but then the angle that my research took was the question of, as a middle class Christian, what to do with the money that does come my way,
Mm-hmm.
and that being my particular focus.
Mm-hmm. And the because a definition I heard a number of years ago was like, oh, poverty is a lack of options, and that really rung with true to me because of everything you just said, Erin. Um, and it's interesting in the Jesus's parable of either the keen steward or the dishonest manager, depending on your translation. Jesus is encouraging the guy trade your access to money for relationships, for the ability to go and be a poor person who stays in the guest room of different people's homes. And maybe we'll get more into that later. Um, but it is, yeah, there's seemed to be this encouragement of he's like, he wants you to be wealthy in some ways, but maybe not in the ways that uh, is prioritizing access to the financial capital. Um, and well, a small plug. There's a book called Money: The True History of a Made-Up Thing. It's written by the guy who hosts the Planet Money podcast, and I just find that really fascinating to kind of actually get an anthropology of money, and it ties up well with that parable because the dishonest manager, he actually has access not to money per se, but to debts. And that's anthropologically actually where money comes out of. It's like social debts to each other. I don't know if that will play more into your research at all, Lakshmi, but uh, could you share more? And as you've done this research on, like, okay, what do we do with these fiscal resources? What's unique what makes that question kind of fresh in the neoliberal age that we are in? How is that different from asking that question maybe a few hundred years ago?
Yeah. And so, as part of this case study approach and ethics that we've been using to research kind of our topics, there is this question around like, where is the power in this? And acknowledging that the capitalist system has immense power, and to choose to step out, to choose to not be financially secure, comes at immense risk, right? And that we're basically not entirely, but almost have to live into this system, and like it's advisable to save for a pension, to have healthcare or pay for healthcare if your employer doesn't pay for it, to pay for a car. And so we're kind of almost entirely, but not entirely, trapped by this system, which forces us to be financially secure for all of our life, in a way that I think is different. And that also the individualism of our society as well, and building on what you said about the wealth of relationships. And so now we're in this society where we are financially independent, and that the family household is the unit for dealing with financial wealth, which is incredibly vulnerable, really, really vulnerable. And so, yeah, I think those complicate things because to choose to not live into that system, you almost need an alternative system to step into. And so then we get into communal economies, which do exist, they're just sparse. And also just realizing that economics is inherently relational. And so to step out of the capitalist system, you have to step into another one. And therefore, but those options have to be created or be more widespread.
I'd like to jump in there as well, just to add to what Lakshmi was saying. I think that you were asking, I think the specific question was about, what's different in neoliberalism, what's different from what it was 200 years ago. And I really like what she had to say, but I also wanted to add in the element of what it means to be a consumer, just tied into individualism or whatever. 200 years ago or 100 years ago, if you had something to buy, you were going to buy it from your neighbor, right? You're going to buy it from the local general store. You were going to, economics was based in relationships. And now I think that our system is, especially if you're a middle class, is so disconnected from those relationships to the point that it is just simply exploitative. And so, like, one of the things that I focused on in a couple of my papers is like if I go buy a pair of pants, right, at Walmart, I'm going to buy blue jeans, right? It is possible for me to buy those blue jeans for, I don't know, $26 or whatever. Quite likely because of sweatshops. Quite likely because the farmer who grew the cotton wasn't paid fairly for the cotton. Quite likely because the guy who, rang me out checkout didn't get paid enough to have health insurance. That's why I could wear those pants so affordably, right? So like the lifestyles that we live as Americans are like come at the expense of other people not having enough. So when you think about the abundance that fills our lives, how much of us have houses with more or homes with more stuff than we need, right? I think that the cheap and easy flow of consumer goods and the idea that we are so distanced from the exploitation that is what makes those goods cheap and easily available is very, very different from what you would have seen 100 years ago. And yet, say again, cognitive dissonance, because I live in a lovely home with too much stuff. Like, I don't want to present myself as someone who has it all figured out, only as someone who sees the problem. And me feeling guilty about that doesn't make anyone's life better. So like there is a very, very good chance that everyone sitting here on this call right now is wearing something that was made by an enslaved person, right? If you've eaten chocolate today, it is likely that someone was enslaved for that. If you had coffee this morning, right? I had coffee this morning, right? When you broaden it out into the broader economic systems, and then you are like, wait a second, I don't want to be a person who causes harm in the world. Like, and then the question becomes, how accountable am I to God for the harm that I cause in the world? And then you say, uh-oh, I really need to rethink what this looks like. And yet, Lakshmi made the point earlier that it's not like you can just say, well, I'll step out of the system. Like I have to wear pants and I don't have a cotton field to grow my own, right? And so I feel like trying to wrestle with the challenges of these issues in the modern era is it creates this like impossible quandary that as Christ followers we are trying to find our way through to navigate, and it's very,
Mm-hmm.
very tricky.
Yeah. Can I add a few extra factors which have come to mind?
Yeah.
Touched about this briefly, but the absence of community. And so I lived with a housemate from Kenya last year, and she was observing that the poverty in America is different to the poverty in Kenya, because in Kenya, like people look after each other. So if someone, obviously this is a broad generalization, but her observation was that in America, people are a lot more alone. And so that if they're in need and financially, there isn't that help from family or friends. Um, and just another factor in there is kind of social security nets. And as someone coming from the UK, I really noticed the absence of a social security net in the US. And so in the UK, there's a sense of like, I can live a riskier life and still have free healthcare, get disability benefits if I need them, or unemployment benefits relatively easily. That might change in a few years' time, but currently there's a pretty robust net. And as a population, that is something that the population likes to have and wants to uphold, in contrast to a more neoliberal kind of economy where it's like all of that's gone. And then once again, you find yourself alone without this wider community of support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about some of the consumerism that you're talking about, Erin, is uh really linked to the industrialism that has developed over the past couple hundred years, and uh all kind of towards the end of the flow, increasing the flow of capital. And I think that's maybe the most basic definition that I might try to give on, like, well, what is a capitalist system? It's like, oh, it's the economic system that prioritizes the free flow of capital. And there's nothing wrong with the flow of capital. That is literally just whatever banknote or, money system you have in your country. It is the ability to hand five whatever to the other person for a good or service. And but when that becomes the priority, and all your relationships start kind of bowing down to that priority, it begins to change things. And that really fosters giant industry, which say, let's not think about where this is coming from. Let's just allow the free flow of capital to move it as fast as possible. It makes certain things efficient. But as from my own manufacturing engineering background, I've come to understand that process efficiency usually comes at the cost of relational depth, and often a kind of relational, uh, kind of like an ecosystem flexibility, like in a kind of more natural ecosystem. It's like if one part weakens, the other part, another part compensates. But in like really efficient systems, it's built to do one thing, and if one thing breaks, the whole thing kind of collapses. And that's kind of what we see right now. It's like, oh, Trump's like, can we fix this and put tariffs on it? And then it's like, oh, well, now everything else starts breaking because we don't have a system that knows how to compensate. And when you talk about, Erin, like, oh, well, is it good for us to just be guilty about these things? It's like, oh yeah, that's not really the goal. It's but how can we start to imagine what a better world is? And we're seeing the fragility of the system we're in, and how it's actually, it most directly starts to hurt the people on the bottom of the system. And it's, yeah, that's all. We won't get into tariffs and policies right now,
But I also
unless you guys have a hot take.
I do not. But I think that a thing that Lakshmi said a little bit ago about like poor people. I think you said your housemate was from Kenya and said that there people stick together, people look out for one another, and here like the hyper individualism. So 2 points I wanted to make. One is that it is very, very possible to live in the world here and not see the poverty, right? It's not always a lack of stuff. They're poor people. They might be your neighbor. They might be your colleague. They might, whatever, right? But they don't always necessarily like walk around looking, quote unquote, poor, right? They might close the way that they present themselves to the world. And yet behind closed doors, there may be economics insecurity. There may be a lot of other challenges. So part of it is you have to choose to see the poor. But I think the bigger picture that I think Lakshmi also alluded, that both of you guys have alluded to, is the idea that the answer comes in community. So I was thinking about the parable of the rich young ruler, right? And he comes to Jesus and he says, "How can I be saved?" And I'm doing all the right things. And a few things I did some research on that one. I wrote a paper on it, and I was trying to say, what do I do with the command to sell everything you have and give the money for, right? And the other piece of that question, like what good does that do, right? Then I'm destitute, then I'm among the poor. Is that holier? Like, I don't know what to do with that, right? When I was doing my research, I considered the very next line, right? Jesus says, sell everything you have and give your money to the poor, and then come and follow me. And when he says, come and follow me, he was inviting the rich young ruler into community, into like, what's the Greek concept? Koinonia, I think it's called. Inviting the rich young ruler to say, come, here we share our resources. We look out for each other. You sell everything you have means that you're contributing to this community that provides for this community. And you in turn will be one of us. You will be a part of us, and your needs too will be cared for, because this is the part of the new family of God that I am here to create. And so like to reflect back on what that means for me is that I'm not necessarily called to sell everything I have and give the money to the poor, in part because that community is not waiting for me. It's not available to me. Like, my mission needs to be to help build that kind of community so that it is available. And so I think this very, very much intersects with community. Community is at the heart of the problem. It's at the heart of like relationship, right? Relationship with ourselves, with creation, with God, with each other, like how we earn, how we spend, what we own, all integrates with all of those things. And it calls us to be thoughtful about it and to find answers to the hard questions and to figure out, then what do I do with that idea?
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I obviously also looked at this passage in doing my research, and I looked at the Mark 10, 17 to 31. And I can really recommend this book by Sondra Eli Wheeler on wealth as power and obligation. And she does an amazing like in-depth take about what the New Testament has to say about wealth. So not just a shallow, like, oh, we have to sell everything and go, but really looking at the depth of different passages. But yeah, she also pulls out this fact of the then come follow me. And she argues that the point isn't the selling of everything, but the point is to follow Jesus, and that wealth gets in, financial wealth or coveting wealth gets in the way of saying yes to Jesus, and pointing out that the people who say no to Jesus in the Gospels are those who haven't been able to let go of their huge financial wealth. So I found that helpful. And then the passage goes on, and the disciples ask, then who can, they're really shocked by this command, because as Erin's also researched, in the Hebrew Bible, there's also tones of wealth being a sign of God's favor. And so she argues that like maybe the disciples were really shocked by this command because like, oh, you're getting rid of like this must be a good man if he's earned God's favor. So I thought, who can be saved? And Jesus answers, for mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible. And so leaning into other passages and research, for me, there's been a growing sense of, though Erin talked about this, inviting into a community, and also a sense of calling by God. And so entering into this space of trust. And so it might not look like a dramatic selling of everything, but feeling that invitation from God to maybe think differently about how I buy clothes, or maybe one day come across an initiative and it's like, oh, I feel really led and called to donate to this. Or I don't have a house personally, but I've heard instances where people have had extra houses and they're like, hey, here's my house for you to start a community. And being open to how God might be calling you to use your wealth. I'm also thinking about the kind of rich woman who donated property to Bonhoeffer so that he could start an underground seminary. And so I'm also open to the fact that God works through philanthropists. And we also see that in the New Testament with kind of wealthy patrons supporting potentially Jesus' ministry, and bringing back the emphasis on what is it that we are being called to do, and being open to the fact that that might look different for different people. And I'm currently in the position of me and my husband are from different continents. And so we have like immigration fees to face at one point, and crossing the ocean to see our families is super expensive. And so there's a part of me who's like, yeah, it's helpful to have a bit in the bank so that me and my husband can live together and see our families. And so a sense of relief about maybe not having to give everything up, but being discerning and being open to where God is calling me, and to the fact that maybe one day that might look like a vow of poverty, and that some people are called to a vow of poverty in the same way that some people do feel called to take a vow of celibacy. But remembering the emphasis on the invitation to follow on what that looks like.
I appreciate both of your guys' connection with the rich young ruler, and the barrier that his possessions are towards that call into following Christ in community, joining that little herd of disciples, who are going about preaching the kingdom of God. And it makes me think of times where I've had people like, oh, well, maybe you should move into a community house. You're really struggling with loneliness. Things are difficult. It seems like just being around more people would do a lot for you. And they had too much stuff. They'd built up their life in their, however big their apartment was, at that point, and unwilling to let it go. And then I've had other roommates where it's like, oh, we need to shuffle around and I need to go move into that room with that person. Well, it'd be a good opportunity for me to downsize a little bit and really, get rid of some stuff that I've not been using anyways. And seeing those kind of difference of responses to, just question kind of, oh, are my possessions serving me and what God's called me to, or are they hindering? And I've definitely felt that kind of guilt before of like, man, I have so much possessions, like are almost like are possessions inherently bad? And then having to start from the basics of just realizing, oh, like if I'm gonna have a certain trade, if I'm gonna do the work that I do, even in the neighborhood, I have to have a computer that I can open, at least 20 tabs on and run emails and do some video calls. And so like, I have to have a computer that's at least a few $100s. And, like that's a possession, and God is not condemning me for having a possession, but it's just really being free to say, oh, if it's helping me serve God and love my neighbors, let me have it. But if not, let me be free to unleash myself from them, and follow where I'm going.
The question then, it requires so much careful discernment. Like I had my gallbladder out a couple months ago, right? I am a
You didn't
member.
need it. It was getting in the way.
Exactly. I didn't need it. But I'm a faithful member of a faith community, right? I have my own little local church. It is wonderful, right? But there's no skilled surgeon there. There was nobody there I couldn't turn to my community for that, right? I turned to the broader
Mhm.
community, but because of that, I had to have enough wealth. I had to have access to insurance. I had to have access to a copay. I had to be able to go see the doctors ahead of time. That requires me to have enough wealth on hand. And then the question becomes, what's enough? And so to tie it, David, back to what you were saying, it's kind of the same thing with possessions, right? And so this fear of scarcity, this idea that, well, I might be able to use this one day, this idea that I mean, I feel like we're all kind of guilty every once in a while of being like, well, I didn't know I needed this thing, but it's on sale. So actually I'm saving money by buying the thing I don't need. Like, haven't we all been there, right? Um, and I think that for me, I obviously I haven't solved any of these problems. I do think very, very thoughtfully and intentionally about my giving to the church, my giving to what charities I support. I'm further along in my career. I also try to be careful about my possessions. I try to buy secondhand. I try not to be consumeristic, although I am afraid. Um, I own my own home, but it occurred to me that this is far too much house for me. That's not like, and so now I have housemates, right? I invite people to live in my space. And so I think
Mhm.
that the point isn't to say that like I have all the answers figured out. Like I'll just tell you and then you'll know what you should do with how much possessions and how much wealth. I think that the challenge is just to be really intentional about it. And as much as we all fret about like, do I have enough stuff when the people next door have cooler stuff? Or do I have enough money for what may come? Like it will never be enough and it will always be enough. And I'll say again, if you're middle class in America, you're among the wealthiest people in the world today. So, you know, find ways to be generous, find ways to be intentional about what you want to do with the responsibility, the obligation, the ethical values that come from that, especially if you are a person of faith who takes that seriously. It's just worth being intentional. And maybe some of you guys, some of the people listening, will find answers and then tell them to me. So I'll know what I should be doing.
Erin, can I ask real quick, as you've leaned into that intentionality, um, there is, I mean, you, while like, how do you make sure that basically guilt's not your driving motive in that? Because it is like, oh, there is a recognition. We are all complicit in like economic evils, and that's just inescapable. And I think there is a righteous response to say, I just want to minimize that. I'm going to, buying secondhand so I minimize exploitative industries. And I'm really with you there. But I just wonder if there's been things that have um, sparked more joy or kind of other motives have emerged in that process.
I think that's a very fair question. I think that in general, I don't think that like guilt is the worst motivator, right? If it prompts you to change your behavior to do things that are different, but you cannot stay there, right? And if I can't say, well, I will feel guilty every time I buy a thing I need because someone might have been exploited, like that you can't live your life in that space. I think that for me, the joy comes in like living ever closer to my values and who I think God wants me to be. The joy comes in the intentionality. And realistically, for me, the joy, I've reached a place in my life where I am in a position to give. I think of myself as like a small scale philanthropist. I am by American standards, just a regular middle class person, right? I'm not wealthy. I can't donate a house to Bonhoeffer's seminary, like Lakshmi was talking about. But I do know that there are needs in my community. in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I can find ways to make that meaningful, both by donating to organizations, by volunteering my time or my skills, by serving my church, by taking if I see the blessings in my life, the wealth, the possessions, the security, the privilege, the opportunity, the education, all those things we talked about in the opening. If I see those as blessings from God, I believe that God's blessings are meant to be shared. And in sharing God's blessings, there is joy, and there is also a reinforcing of community. The community that God calls us to is reinforced when we give our time, when we give our skills, when we give our money. We are like upbuilding community and making other people stronger. And there's absolutely, I think, joy in that.
Yeah, thank you. Um, are you okay if I ask you a question, Lakshmi? So you mentioned Sondra Eli Wheeler, Wealth as Peril and Obligation. Um, and but you've also researched a number of different authors. And as you've gone into this research, have you gained kind of I don't know, well, I, you've developed really good schematics on other things. Do you have kind of different categories of like, oh, there's kind of this group of Christians who think about money this way or have these emphases? Are there different camps, different emphases? What have you seen as you've gone into this research?
A great question. In terms of the books that I read, I did come across two different camps-ish, broadly speaking. And so those who are more focused around like the individual and becoming more generous and less attached to financial and material wealth as a way of personal spiritual growth. And they talked about their relationship with God and through faith being drawn into deeper generosity, and in that being drawn to deeper generosity, feeling freer and spiritually freer. And maybe slightly more evangelical leaning. Or yeah, just really comfortable with the language of genuine encounter with God and relationships. So that I use evangelical more in the British way, not the American way. And then other authors, which were slightly more higher church in terms of their authorship, with more of an emphasis on economic justice and what can be done as community. And so they were mostly writing to the church and what can church communities be doing and how can we as groups kind of go up against this capitalist system. So mostly critiquing and suggesting some alternatives. But not wrestling. These authors didn't really wrestle with the individual and the status of being a middle-class Christian and what to do with individual wealth. And I actually found myself more compelled by weirdly maybe, more of the individual wealth and bringing in that spirituality and that relationship with God. And so like, obviously economic justice matters and there are things to be done there. But I think it's to do with the space that I'm personally in and why I approached this research. And I needed to know what my relationship was with wealth and what I am meant to do. I have no questions about the fact that we should be working towards a more economically just society. That's just a given. But there was more questions of like, why is it that as individuals, we don't talk about our own personal money and what is my stance. Sondra Eli Wheeler and her book that came in at a different angle and more of like a very biblical kind of exegesis angle. And her book confirmed an inclination that I was feeling around this, and which the more individual spiritual people are talking about, of this is a journey with God. And what is God calling you to do? And God is there to help you. And you can't do it out of your own strength. But there is discernment in that and a call to follow. And that call to follow doesn't necessarily mean letting everything go. As I previously said. And she highlighted the fact that the New Testament does not paint possessions as inherently. It's not Gnostic. It's not material bad, spiritual good. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And how Paul worked as a tent maker to earn his living and tried, where possible, not to have to rely on people's donations, and where possible, to earn for himself and not be dependent. And there are guidelines against in Thessalonians, so it's like, don't be lazy and live off other people's work, like work. um,
Mm-hmm.
and so that argument, and something which was also highlighted to me, not by a specific author, but through kind of engaging with all of these authors and different ethics case study approaches, is how personality and character interacts with this question. And that really resonated with me. And so, for example, personally, I don't consume a great amount, but that comes really easily to me. Simplicity comes more easily. Also knowing that is linked to the fact that self-denial is probably more of a vice of mine. And so, which links to a lack of generosity for myself and others. Recognizing that as a person, I generally don't do things half-heartedly, and which is probably bringing me to this question of like, oh, if I take my faith seriously, what does that mean? Because my personality takes me there. In a class, seminary class, we were talking about scrupulosity, which is a form of OCD, and how that interacts with faith, and how, for example, Martin Luther, in writing his 95 Theses, is an example of a scrupulous personality, or like people in history who have kind of self-flagellated in the name of faith. And so just being able to recognize where our personal vices are and how they link to the question of wealth. And so for me, also recognizing that whilst I might not buy a huge amount of things, a part of me finds a great amount of security in having some savings, and how to loosen that grip. And I know people who really inspire me because they own things, but they have a really loose grip on things that they do own. So it's like, oh, hey, they have this thing. Oh, hey, yeah, have this money. And so then it's not about what you have, but about what your relationship with it is, which I think is also, and I quite like the language of disordered relationship to ordered relationship, and noticing where my disordered relationship is with wealth and money, and how to bring it into an ordered relationship, which brings me closer to God.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you bringing up the personality piece, because that's been part of my own journey. There's a book called True Riches by John Cortines and Gregory Balmer. And they were like two friends who met at like an MBA program. And they had just radically different approaches to money, but they both eventually realized that they weren't very biblical. But one was like the saver and one was the spender. And they both weren't really thinking, well, what does God want for it? But just like, oh, they're kind of critical on each other. And there's some things right about it, but just how much, oh yeah, it's like, it's really easy for those who are like more naturally simplistic. I don't need a lot, to just think, oh, we must be more righteous with how we're dealing with money. And like, oh, C.S. Lewis, who was more ready to like, there's some anecdote of him like, giving 10 shillings or whatever to the homeless guy, and his friend saying he's just going to spend that on alcohol. And C.S. Lewis was like, well, that's what I was going to do. And so it's like, he's like, I was going to be generous with myself with alcohol, so he might as well let him have some alcohol. And realizing my personality as an engineer, I thought that like I would achieve righteousness through a really well-developed budget and living in this great system. And there was actually a way that budgeting for eating out gave me some freedom from my scrupulosity, where I didn't have to feel guilty every single time I bought something at a restaurant, because I have already prayerfully set aside some money to eat out. And it was like, oh, I now have freedom to spend money, and this is so good. And I can just be thoughtful about where I want to spend what I've budgeted. But kind of getting the leading from God, but still hold that budget loosely. Still know that this is just a tool to help you take the next step, and still very much, trying to just hold my hands open. God, what do you want? for me and money and possessions, and that process. Yet the I'm curious. I've seen both. You mentioned the camp of the kind of those who are more focused on the individual personal piety and that spiritual growth with money, and those who are more focused on the big economic systems. And can see people get so focused on the economic systems that they're not actually doing any self-critical work. And it's like, well, the real problem is the billionaires, so I don't need to ever ask God about my own money. Um, and but kind of on the flip side of like the millionaires not asking, how'd you become a millionaire? Like, and it can be difficult. It's like, and some of them are really devout and have developed, become kind of incredible philanthropists. But I wonder if they've, yeah, thought creatively or just done some of that more big picture deconstructive work to say, maybe I shouldn't have gotten that rich to begin with. And I should have been giving my employees much higher raises or something, and much better benefits. Um, and anyways, have you seen any of that kind of dialect between those two camps? What's been your processing through those things?
I don't know, Erin, whether you have any thoughts. I personally focused on like the middle class level. I was like, I'm not going to extend to the millionaire billionaire class because that's not currently where I am. And yeah, so I don't have much to comment there. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
whether Erin, you do.
So, a couple of things. One, I think that um, I just to challenge you on that question. I feel like anytime we talk about wealth and the responsibilities, we always talk about the millionaires and the billionaires, right? Because they clearly have a lot more than us. There are very few of them. The middle class is relatively sizable, and so I try never to talk about the choices that they're making without reflecting back on the choices that I'm making. Because, like I said in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
if you're middle class in America, if you have technology, access to healthcare, shelter, food, stability, you are among the wealthiest people in the world today. So I'm not a billionaire, but I try not to separate from myself because if there is a line drawn about who is wealthy and who is not, and who do these like ideas and responsibilities apply to, we're above that. We're above that line. So there's that caution. And then the other thing about it is sometimes it requires kind of disentangling ourselves from just presumptions that are built into our culture, that are built into consumerism. And one of those presumptions is that wealth is a reflection of virtue. If you are wealthy, you must have worked hard. You must have made really responsible choices. And in some cases, that's true. The downside of that is if you are poor, it's probably your own fault because of your moral failings and irresponsibility. And I feel like we all like recognize that that is not true. How much of it comes down to the circumstances you were born in, the stability of your family, opportunities that fell in your lap, whether or not you won the lottery. There are people who make very responsible choices and very careful choices and are unlucky and find themselves destitute. And there are people who make all kinds of terrible choices and end up wealthy. Like the world is complicated and messy. Um, but I think that when we're trying to think about our own obligations and responsibilities, and also when we're trying to think about economic justice and the bigger picture, it's useful to reflect on and to challenge like any of the ways where those assumptions might be built in that don't come from God and don't match up with your lived experience, but kind of like weasel their way into your thinking because they come from culture. There are more examples of that as well, but this idea that wealth and virtue go together is actually really damaging because it blames poor people for being poor, which is in most cases pretty ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
I don't know that
And
exactly answered your question, but
no, I appreciate both because the pushback of like we're always like, oh yeah, let's critique the other people. In light, I think the only, and I think we do have to do it with a lot of like uh spiritual hesitancy because of how much we're, free to point out the speck in someone else's eye instead of the log in our own. But because we do naturally esteem the wealthy, there is something to dethroning the Bezos and the Musks from being admirable figures and being like, why are there so many complaining Amazon workers? Um, and you have so much resources. Like, I bet you could do something about how sad they are, and it might make you a little less wealthy, probably still plenty wealthy, and be able to then say, okay, what are the ways that I have responsibility in my life? Am I doing something that is empowering my wealth accumulation over and above those where I have relational influence? One of my favorite books on economics and the Christian life is called Practicing the King's Economy. I might have given away my most recent copy. And it is really great because it goes into some of this kind of biblical big pictures, includes Sabbath economics, but also really practical, both for individuals, churches, businesses. And he gives just like a really poignant example for the middle class of like hire someone to mow your lawn. Not saying it, but like as an idea. And he's like, the middle class mindset is typically save, save, save. And he's like, but if your neighbor can have a good, dignifying job, it's better for you to use your money to invest in that person and their business than to just being like, oh, well, I could do that. I could keep saving. I could do all this work. And you're just building more of that isolation from your local economy, um, because we've been told that's what's right is to accumulate that wealth. And rather than look for opportunities to give dignified work to people. And so that to me that it's related to that like, oh, we've we've created these middle class assumptions that seem to be connected to that, just like, oh, we trust the people who've accumulated a lot of wealth and we actually have built some of those habits ourselves. Um if
I
you
like the idea
uh
that it makes a lot of sense to me. One challenge with it, just personally, is that sometimes I feel like
mhm,
money changes relationships. There's a power dynamic, right? I
yeah.
I have a friend who is unfortunately right now unemployed. I have a lot of painting that needs to be done at my house. She loves to paint. I'm like, oh, this is perfect, right? And we've set it up that way. And yet, like, if she doesn't do it the way I like it, what if she like I'm the one with the money? I'm the one with the power. Like it's such a disruptive it can be a disruptive thing on an individual and interpersonal level. Like when I hire things done, feel like a snob. It feels self-indulgent, right? But at the same time, it very much is of value. And the way that I try to counterbalance that, you can see I'm kind of a guilt-driven person. A lot of things make me feel guilty, but I try to counterbalance that. First of all, by hiring people to help me with things when I need help with them, but also by living my life in a way that is interdependent and relational. So whether I'm going to pay a friend to help me with something or just ask them for a favor, I feel really comfortable doing that because I show up for them. You might give me a ride to the airport, but
Mhm.
I picked your kids up from school last week when there was an emergency. Like we when we depend on each other, um, that the reciprocity builds relationship. And if you can fit money into a system that has that kind of ebb and flow, givers and takers, relationships where people depend on each other, that can minimize the impact of like, well, I'm the one with the money, so I have the power, and I will just hire like I don't have to deal with real problems because I can just pay other people to do that, right? It always feels self-indulgent and gross. So it was interesting to hear you present it as, there's something noble there in giving somebody the opportunity and paying them, fairly for hard work that they've done. And I think that if you put that in the context of like reciprocal relationships within community, it can be a great thing where everybody benefits.
Yeah. Uh, I think that's such the challenge to, because Aaron, a lot of what you shared is trying to get the middle class to recognize that they, in fact, are, I mean, globally quite high up. Um, but even locally, still the middle class. You're not the lower class. And I've recognized my own discomfort in that situation of like, um, of being a higher class person. As we said, even like, oh yeah, even if I don't have a lot of money, my education, my access, my cultural competency makes me kind of this like, in some form, the higher class, the privileged, and it can be deeply uncomfortable when I'm trying to build kinship relationships with those who aren't of the same class. I try to go like under the radar, and I feel like I'm just fooling myself. Like they all know,
So
and
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted, but that instinct is universal. If you ask Americans where they fall on the the social class, the scale, right? Like 88% or something like that of people will say, "Oh, I'm middle class." And that includes, I mean, you notice that like the uber duper wealthy of the world work really hard to present like they're just regular folk wearing jeans and turtlenecks, right? They're like, "Ah, I'm middle class." The the poor work very hard to present themselves as middle class and think of themselves as middle class is because of stigma. If you're poor, like nobody wants to be thought of as poor in a world where poor equates to lazy and irresponsible, right? So they will work hard not to think of themselves that way and not to present that way. If you're rich, there's something that's like, gross and exploitative, and the opulence, the show offiness of it has become kind of distasteful. So everybody wants to be middle class because middle class means, hardworking, patriotic, red blooded American, right? There's something like there's this whole like ethos, this whole sort of worldview built into that. And because we are affected by the culture that are around us, like David, I'm in the same place. I am in fact solidly middle class, or probably upper middle class. Like when you look at where I fall in the system, I'm like, no, 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 that can't be right. I'm in the middle, in the safe, like respectable, virtuous middle. When in actuality, like it is what it is. And like beyond just having to wrestle with the discomfort of it is trying to figure out what to do about it. What does it obligate you to? Why has God given you the opportunities
Mhm.
to have this level of income or build this level of wealth? And how are you called then to share them? Like what do you do with that? And it is uncomfortable. And I would say it should be uncomfortable. Like that's part of the blessing. And it sounds like we all are in our own circumstances, like having to wrestle with what that means. And maybe we find different answers, but there's beauty in the challenge of it. Part of my goal is always to get people to say, oh, wait a second, this is challenging. This is hard, but it actually matters and it means something for me too. So I feel like for anybody who's listening, if you think about like it makes you uncomfortable, like that's a sign that it's probably a really good idea to like lean in. It's what is it? John Wesley? He calls it convicting grace, right? Sometimes guilt is a sign that God is trying to tell you something. So yeah, lean into that discomfort because there's a sign, there's an obligation, there's work to be done there.
Lakshmi, you've traveled a little bit more than me. Is that middle class uh kind of, I don't know, I don't know the right word, but kind of like everybody trying to pretend they're middle class? Do you see that as more American, or do you see that elsewhere?
Yeah, really good question. Since being in the US, I have perceived a different understanding of middle class. And so even in Kamala's campaign, this idea of like making people middle class, whilst in the UK there's more of a fixed class system. So I feel like Americans prize this upward mobility and like, you can increase and you can progress up this ladder. Whilst in the UK it's just a bit more cultural. And so it's like, I'm working class and that's my culture, those are my people. I'm middle class, that is my culture, those are my people. I'm upper middle class, that's my culture, those are my people. And personally, I felt less of a striving. And someone asked me like whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm not entirely sure. Um,
Mm.
but there's a sense of it's a bit more stratified and a bit more fixed. And then wealth doesn't make a difference because there are just cultural markers. And so um, you can be upper middle class, but technically not that financially wealthy. But the way that you act and your hobbies and your interests will flag you as someone from an upper middle class kind of background. And so it's more cultural versus actual material wealth. I also find obviously there's poverty in the UK, but I found it less. It feels different. I think the increased social security net changes things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The what I love about the Wheeler's book title, "Wealth as Peril and Obligation," um, is focusing on the obligation part right now. It in the more stratified, fixed social classes, are there more recognized obligations that the classes have towards each other? Because I think what part of the discomfort that like everyone pretends we're middle class is that we can all like keep that individualistic. We don't have obligations to one another, because we're all the same. And we're all going to keep pretending we're the same, whether we have like $1 in a bank account or like 50 million, and we're all the same.
That's a really interesting question. I haven't really felt it. And so part of my wrestling with this question is having floated around, grown up in more of my family being more middle class and we're European, like my parents aren't English, so we're also I'm a second generation immigrant, so we fit into that differently. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but growing up in a more working class town and then ending up at university in a solidly more upper middle class environment. But then and a lot of Christians in that upper middle class environment, but not really wrestling with that. And so the sense like, oh, we're Christian and we really want to do good, but not always. There are the exceptions, and then there are groups who are really wrestling with that and who are really thinking about what it means and what to do. But I also see a lot of not talking about it in church. And there is less integration than would probably be good. I feel like the classes kind of do keep to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Which I think I've seen a little bit in my area, at least a little bit of rise of working class solidarity, and so I've been grateful to witness that.
Um, and also, just to add to my previous thing, and Erin talking
Mm-hmm.
about how the middle class is perceived as sensible and worthy, I think in the UK there's more of a thing of seeing people in the class above you as like snooty or like not good. And so there's a sense of like people belong to their own group, and it's like the other group, like, why would you want to be like that? So there's a cultural difference.
If you guys still have a few more minutes, I would really love to hear your thinking, Lakshmi, especially on this intersection of intentional Christian communities and wealth, and just how is that integrated into your research and what thoughts have come out of that?
Mm. Yes. In terms of intentional Christian community, I think the intersection is that people who live in intentional Christian community are often wrestling with these questions, and it feeds into why they live into intentional Christian community. I talked about the fact that stepping out of the kind of neoliberal capitalist exploitative system necessitates stepping into another system, and that intentional Christian communities provide that to varying degrees. And so there's a sense of like, oh, you can still hang on to your savings, but actually we're going to have a common food budget and we're going to set money aside to help our community, or on the other end of the spectrum, like full common purses. And so I think intentional Christian communities are a witness that another way is possible, which is a line the Broodhoff often use as well. And I think those witnesses are so important. And it's just like, we can do it. Like, if we group together, we can create these alternative economies or alternative micro economies. And even on the micro scale, it makes a big difference. And in intentional Christian communities, there's naturally a prioritization of relationship that feels like the natural currency and the currency which people are cultivating. And therefore, which I get inspired by, because in intentional Christian community, I've been really inspired by the generosity of other people, or how they've been made possible by the generosity of others. And so I was like, oh, like you can live outside of this mindset of just saving and living in a little household and doing it that way. And you can branch out.
There's this work by Peter Singer. He's an ethicist, and he's done some really controversial stuff, but he wrote this book called The Life You Can Save. And I haven't read his book yet. I haven't read it yet. I saw this story on YouTube, and you can find it. And I think it's how he opens his book. And it's about, the story, kind of a parable, right? There's a guy walking through a town square or something. And it's like kind of dusky, and there's nobody else around. And I might be getting the details wrong, so forgive me. But he's walking past the fountain, right? He sees there's a small child drowning in the fountain, right? And he's like, well, the water's not that deep. Like, I can just step in and help him, but my shoes cost like $250, and I got places to go. And so he walks on by, right? And so Peter Singer, he asks his audience, like, what do you think of that guy? And the response is universally like, this guy is a monster, right? Who would let a child drown to save $250 or whatever? And Peter Singer then comes back and is like, you're that guy. Like, David, do you have $250? Lakshmi, could you come up with $250? You need, like, I have $250. And he's like, do you know how many malaria bed nets that would buy? Do you know how many kids with schistosomiasis could be cured? It's a totally curable and preventable, like, waterborne illness that is killing children. And he's like, does it matter that in the parable, this kid was right in front of the guy? And in our lives, we're more distanced from it. Like, maybe we've distanced ourselves intentionally so that we don't have to feel obligated. But I have wrestled with that story for forever. And I told you I'm kind of guilt driven, and it has very much been a driving force. And now anytime, like, if I order something from Amazon, or if I go out to dinner, right, I'll be like, I could have eaten at home for $5. And instead, with tip, I just spent $30. Like, there's a bed net, right? There's, food for a day for a family of 6 children in a developing nation. And so I cannot, to your point earlier, I cannot walk around carrying that kind of guilt and being super motivated by it. But that story was really challenging, really convicting, and I have been wrestling with it ever since.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's actually one of the things I had jotted down. I was like, oh, I'd like to get to this. And I was like, what's it called? Economic utilitarianism? And then I was just Googling while you were talking. And the thought is called effective altruism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea of, okay, if I want to be altruistic, I want to do the most good in the world, like, oh, with my $30, I can feed 10 kids in India, but only 1 kid in the US. So it leads to this that's the utilitarian of just, where can my dollar do the most good? And I'm just kind of like abstracting myself. And the trouble I've had from it is how it feels like it's operating off of the same psychology as consumerism, which is abstracted relationships.
Yep.
And I'm just like, it feels, I mean, in some ways almost like satanic, in the sense of that, like, it's killing our, like, the Imago Dei relationships. And when I look at the books that I like most respect on this, it's like, what's his name? John Perkins on This Is Beyond Charity, is a number of them around Christian community development. And his first call in his like 3 R's, it's towards the end of racial reconciliation. And the middle R is redistribution. But the first R is relocation. And his emphasis is you gotta remove yourself. And so like you're totally right of like we have done things that separate ourselves. Like we've moved to the suburbs so that I don't have to be close to the poor. And so I feel like we must do that first R. But if we just like stay in the suburbs and try to ship the money to the poor, like I mean, like we can't relocate ourselves everywhere. And I'm not saying you like only hand out things in person, but like other thing of like small is beautiful is thinking about like you can only steward your relationships, your employees, and the land if you keep it local to a certain degree. Like, um, and the economies of scale are killing relationships. And so that's where like the parable of the keen steward has been so meaningful to me, and with the ones you brought up of just like Jesus's desire is is I think like the kingdom is first and foremost relational. And this Peter Singer thing, I'm just like, oh, that just feels like a tool to guilt rich people to send money into some nonprofit around the world who are intrinsically doing good things. But if those good things even like don't net in relationships being restored, and even the really tough thing of relationships being restored between the rich and the poor, if we just keep living in our stratified systems, I feel like we're still missing out on the kingdom of God. Um, and and so I'm like, I'm never going to tell someone not to like give towards whatever their heart's compelled to. I just want to say like, because I mean Jesus says where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. So if your treasure's with those people, go relocate or at least go visit and build those relationships. Like that's
So
my strong kind of conviction.
it's a concept of cheap grace. Like if you're willing to drop change into the cup of a panhandler, right? It costs you nothing. If you're not willing to, look this person in the eye, to give them the time of day, to acknowledge your shared humanity. And I absolutely hear what you're saying about charity and forms that separate us. But at the end of the day, not like we are called into relationship. At the same time, not all relationships are about us. So if I'm going to donate, one of the things that was uh, tugging at my heartstrings and still is, I wrestle with this a lot, was like the humanitarian crisis at the border. Now the focus is much more on deportations, which are heartbreaking for an entirely different reason. But back when you had like impoverished people who'd made a journey thousands of miles sleeping in parking lots, like I very much hear what you're saying about like, I don't have relationships, but you know what? They need a sandwich. And I could find an organization where someone is going to step in and give
Mm-hmm.
these kids food, right? And so I like this idea that when there are situations where I can't be in that relationship, I can look for organizations that are doing relational work. And so instead, I chose an organization that was doing both kind of like advocacy and lobbying around this issue, that was doing free pro bono legal work, and that was also handing food and blankets to families living in parking lots. And so I guess that would be my only, I think that you make very, very good points. I think it's totally fair. And I agree with you that that's a real risk of being guilt driven in your approach to charity. But don't let that absolve you of your responsibility to be doing something intentional. And sometimes the need doesn't have to have you and your relationship at the heart of it. Sometimes somebody just needs a sandwich, right? Give them
Yeah.
bread, whether or not you have the opportunity to be in relationship. Give because you can, because God has given to you.
Mm-hmm.
But in an ideal world, also be looking for those ways that you're giving can be creating relationship, drawing you into relationship with other people. I think both perspectives are true.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very juicy topic. You go, David.
Uh, totally. Yeah, there could be a way to like over center ourselves, but will still come up of like, oh, do you give to the people or like if you have two organizations to choose from and one is like pumping out food from the factory and getting it to feed those kids as quick as possible, and they developed this really efficient system, versus those who say, hey, we can go camp out there and like uh, we need a little bit of funding for our camp supplies, and we'll be able to feed about 100 people. Um, just like, oh, like relationships always cost more, even when it's like not your relationships. And I'm just very, because of my engineering background, wary of the way efficiency is so enticing, but so detrimental. And so I'm told, like, the churches gathered money, sent it to Jerusalem, and like there's ways to have distant relationships and such things.
But to your point, that the Peter Singer story that I shared, this parable with the toddler in the fountain, and he's saying, he's convicting you of that. The examples that he provided were about, curable diseases in developing nations. The same principle absolutely applies. If you are called to be thinking of that in a much more direct and relational way, like those same $250 that can, save kids in developing nations can also be saving families here, can help an impoverished person who's really, really struggling to, like is trying to decide between paying rent and buying groceries for the kids. Like these are people who are living in our own communities who also need that support. And so I feel like it matters. It matters who we choose to give, to donate money to if we want to give money. But if we are thoughtful and intentional and seek some calling in it, and if we, like scripture talks about being a cheerful giver, if we do it with an attitude of generosity, if we add our prayers to our giving, right? Like we want to be wary of the kind of giving that sets us apart and is distant. That doesn't mean it's never appropriate. Like kind of seek your own conscience. You got $30, spend some time thinking about where it should go. But I think that in answer to your challenge, which I think was a very wise and insightful one, I think it's both and. Or at the very least, sort of situational, that there are circumstances in which, it's this way or that way. And I try to do that with my own giving. I do give to a global charity that I care about. I do give to my church. I do give to specific causes once in a while. I also try to make sure that every year there is someone in my own community. I try to do it anonymously when I can, but I try to make sure there's someone in my own community so that I can see directly like who is benefiting from this giving. And I don't want to give the impression that it's, a ton, but I'm very careful and thoughtful and intentional about what it looks like. And hopefully with God's grace, like that's a thing that I'll continue to do and feel okay about.
Yeah, little gifts of love go a long way.
Yeah. But I heard a podcast episode with a couple. This young woman was in college and heard a, I don't know, I suppose a conversation like this. And she was like, she said, I've always been middle class, but I want to make a commitment to giving half of every penny I earn to charity. And then she found a partner for life who she married who agreed. And so this young couple, they live reasonably well. They got college degrees and whatever. And I thought, man, what would that have looked like if I had had this perspective? I mean, I'm coming up on 50 years old. But if I had thought, when I was 18 or when I was 20 or when I was 22 about like, what are my obligations? If I had thought of myself as rich instead of, I mean, certainly there were times when I ate ramen because my payday wasn't till Friday. And, it hasn't always been easy, but it was always easier I've never gone hungry. Millions of people do. And so I wish that I had started younger on thinking about these things, because I think there are people who live it out in more radical ways, like this couple. I'm like, that's amazing. Inspiring.
A brief thing, and then I'll give you the last word, Lakshmi. My uncle, who's an accounting professor, wrote a book called The Principle of Maximums, and his kind of practice was set maximums on your savings, on your retirement accounts, and whatever your standard of living, so that when God blesses you with more, it becomes extremely easy to be a generous giver. You're like, oh, it's beyond my maximum. Send it away. And
I
it's just
love that.
so, it's been very freeing for me to just be like, oh, I only need this much money each year. If I get more, send it away. um, Lakshmi, what are your final thoughts?
So I'm thinking about the both and of kind of donating and being present. I just think about the analogy of that there are babies coming down the river. I feel, oh my gosh, there are babies drowning in the river. We need to fish the babies out. And then someone's like, hey, why are babies going down the river? And they go upstream to figure out why there are babies in the river. And like the fact that different people feel called to different things, and you also need people financially supporting the people who are taking the babies out of the river, and financially supporting the babies upstream who are trying to figure out why there are babies in the river. And I kind of do trust how different people are being led. And so, Erin, it feels like you do feel called to like financially give, and that's important to you, and that's where your heart is. And David, like you're really invested, especially invested in like the being for the relocating and the being physically there. And obviously both of you do both of those opposite things as well. And being able to trust our leadings. And then I'll say, in terms of that guilt about not having done more, I think just God uses us as we are and how our life is. And like Paul was a murderer before he started evangelizing, and like so many of the people in the Bible did terrible things. And so I don't think we can overly look back. And I think we just have to trust what God is doing in our life and strive to be as close as possible to God. And I think the final thing that I want to bring out is a quote which is attributed to Howard Thurman. And he says, "Don't ask what the world needs, but what makes you come alive, because the world needs more people who have come alive." And I really like that as a quote, because I do feel that once we found the thing or like the things which make us come alive, I think that's when we resonate with the spirit, or there's something about that which I think is sacred. And it gets beyond that utilitarian thinking. And so I think each of us there are different things which make us come alive. There are different aspects of this problem which make us come alive. And that there's a certain element of trust in going with that. And I find the metaphor of the body of Christ incredibly helpful in that. And we're just filling out different portions.
Yeah. Yeah. Or many seeds in the garden of God.
Yeah.
I think okay. My two last questions are there any specific Bible verses that maybe we lightly touched on or haven't touched on that just have been formative for either of you in how you're thinking about money and what's been driving you, and which really shapes how you're trying to steward the wealth God has given you? And then my second or like final question is like, I initially had typed it out as, can the middle class inherit the kingdom of God? To which maybe the Bible answer is, well, with God, all things are possible. But from, just your time thinking on these questions for both of you, what are some really important principles or practices that you think that help the middle class step towards the kingdom of God and what Christ wants to build here?
So I will share a scripture. I don't know that I would call it formative, because I was kind of well into thinking through these questions when I sort of kind of discovered it and thought it relevant. But I think that it answers a little bit to both of your questions. It comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and we don't usually go back to, well, at least in my faith tradition, like we're not digging into the Old Testament. We're not going back that far. But I like this one. It's Deuteronomy 8, 17 to 18. It says, "You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors, as it is today." And he spent a little time reflecting on that. And it reminds me of, what is that comment that I think President Obama got in trouble for. Like, you didn't build that. That's what this verse is saying, right? It's saying like you might be sitting there being like, well, I'm wealthy because I'm awesome, because I work really hard and I make great choices. And this scripture reminds you to be humble and to remember those opportunities and those rewards come from God. And so, in answer to the
Mm-hmm.
question about like how like what habits to develop, one of them should really be gratitude. One of them should really
Mm-hmm.
be like the humility to think through, like, certainly it's fine to feel good about, the life you've built, the money you've made, the skills that you, or the products you produce to sell or whatever. Like, it's fine to feel good about those things, but always remember that there are people who work just as hard as you, who like are just as smart as you, if who have good ideas, who have not had the opportunity to do those same things. And so approach your life with gratitude for the blessings. Force yourself to wrestle in the places that make you uncomfortable. Think deeply about who God calls you to be and what you're supposed to be doing with the blessings in your life. Be intentional about that. Um, and then just be a little bit humble, a little bit of grace for yourself while you figure it out, a little bit of generosity to people in need, to people in your life, and grace for them as well. Because I think we're all trying to figure it out in our own little corners.
Thank you.
Great questions, David. In terms of the Bible verses, I'd bring back the rich young ruler, and that line about kind of with God all things are possible, and also Luke 12:22-34, which is the passage like, "Do not worry, consider the lilies in the field; they have everything you need. Why do you worry?" And I found that really challenging, and it challenged me on how much I actually trust God with my life, and I don't think that means I don't think that's a call to be reckless. And so it's challenged me to wrestle with that line of trusting in God and not being too flippant either. And in terms of principles and practices, something which has really emerged for me from sitting with this question and researching around it is trusting the work that God is doing in me and trying to be attentive to that.
Mm-hmm.
I also was thinking, I don't think God wants me to be overly fretting either, and overly consumed in a way which is paralyzing or inhibiting. So obviously there's a balance to be drawn, and I think that balance is probably different based on different personalities. But for me, there's a sense of, oh, I'm already getting better. I'm starting to loosen my grip. That has been through the help
Mm-hmm.
of people in my life, and God giving me the opportunity to practice that. And to just keep trusting that, and to just still be attentive and aware of what I'm wrestling with, and trusting what will unfold from that. I also think of the fact that, like, really significant people in history, like Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King, for example, both came from really privileged backgrounds. And for them in their life, wrestling with what to do with their wealth wasn't really the crux of what they were being called to do. And I think that I'm using this as a case in point of following God can just look so different. And so in their particular instances, that it was about being free and free to do the really difficult thing. That was maybe tied to wealth in a bit, but it wasn't the center of the question. And so I think for me, there's a journey of not fully decentering wealth, but making sure that God is the center. And at this present moment, I don't feel called to a vow of poverty, but open to the fact that that might be demanded of me further down the line, or that something significant might be demanded, and just being open to the work that God is doing through me, but
Mm-hmm.
not to use that as an excuse either. And so it's always those tensions.
Mm-hmm.
Likes
That
me. I love what you said about do not fret, because I'm a fretter. It's just in my nature to fret. But it made me think. You and I have both referenced the story of the rich young ruler in Mark, and a thing that blew my mind when I really dug into that story. I was so focused on the sell everything you have, give money to the poor. That for starters, I skipped the part that said then come and follow me, which we talked about earlier. But the other thing that appears in that story is that when the ruler comes up, when the rich young ruler approaches Jesus and he's like, please help me, whatever. The like Jesus, it says that here you've got this self-righteous rich dude who's desperate for assurance of salvation, and Jesus kind of he doesn't really call him out on his self-righteousness, but that he sees it, right? Like, it's not about doing all the things. Like, I'm calling you to something different. But somewhere in that verse in Mark, it also says, Jesus looked at him and loved him. So if I'm feeling insecure, if I'm working hard to be righteous and do all the right things, right? Like, Jesus sees through that. If I'm approaching Jesus saying, I'm afraid because I know I'm screwing it up, Jesus sees through that. Jesus' response to the rich young ruler says Jesus looked at him and loved him, and then gave him this gift of an invitation into community. And I think that when you were talking about not fretting, like the lilies of the fields, I thought about that, like Jesus looks at me and loves me. So it can't be wrestling in a way that is so guilt-focused, guilt-driven, that it's beating myself up, which isn't doing anybody any good. And there has to be room for grace and a little bit of faith in God's faithfulness to us while we wrestle with hard things.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Erin. Because I think I can have been in those, like, it's like, oh, until I free myself from that guilt, then I'm not really walking in God's love or something, and it's like, oh, he saw him and he loved him, and we start from there and then enter deeper into the invitation. And if I can add a answer, the Lakshmi, you just mentioned the lilies of the field, the sparrows who God cares for and provides. I think it's Walter Brueggemann who says, God's promise there is in part a saying, like, when you are like, this is true, if you are a lily in the field, a lily on the path won't uh won't thrive. And there's an invitation for the rich young ruler of, like, hey, your needs may not actually be met if you hold on to your possessions, but they will be if you come and follow me. Like, you are stepping out of one system and into another system. And so, yeah, that's just been, I think, one of the big reflections from this conversation for me, is just continuing to think about, oh, what system are we able to, step by step, as God works in our hearts, God works in our relationships, to step into. And that takes faith, that takes trust, that takes the work of the Spirit in our lives. And a very, and it will look, both on the personality side and different countries and localities. I hope to have more conversations in the future that continue to just explore, how are people asking these questions, but then creatively figuring out ways, it's like, and like your situation as an international married couple, what are the creative solutions that you're finding to hold those, relational tensions together? Will look different, than me, who is trying to be as, rooted in my neighborhood and travel, don't have as many obligations to travel. So yeah, thank you both so much. Really appreciated this conversation.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
any last thoughts that you wanted to add before we go?
Oh, actually, so I had to create a PowerPoint for this research for a class, and I ended up wanting to pick this page from a picture book, which I absolutely love. And I just picked the image first. So, like, this is a good image which conveys the liberation which I think God wants for us. Coming back to the not fretting. And then and then I later saw that the picture book words were about becoming That you, God's you, will be hopeful and kind, a giver who lives with all heart, soul, and mind. So I just thought it was really sweet. And I think that is the invitation, and that God is with us in that journey and in that process.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
I so want to know what book that is.
I will tell you. I don't have the book with me right now, but I will send you a picture.
You're going to add it to the bibliography.
Yes.
Thank you, listeners. I hope that this was a fruitful, thoughtful conversation for y'all. Feel free to send anything our way with your own thoughts. Bye.
Thanks so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.